Good afternoon. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're just going to take a second for some of our guests to sign on. I am delighted today to introduce to you two of our fellows in FPRI's Eurasia program, Eilish Hart and Rob Lee, who have agreed to join us for a very important discussion about the tensions building up between Russia and Ukraine over the past few weeks, more than usual, to say the least. Eilish Hart is a fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program, and she's the editor of our BMB Ukraine newsletter, to which you can subscribe by going on our website, fpri.org, visiting the Eurasia programs page, and checking out our BMB Russia and BMB Ukraine newsletters. You won't regret doing that. Rob Lee is also a fellow in our Eurasia program, and he's also a PhD candidate at King's College London, War Studies Department. As I mentioned earlier, today the discussion will be about the increasing tensions between Russia and Ukraine. For your information, we'll be pasting some maps and links in the chat box that I encourage you to visit for the visual, for illustration of this discussion. Eilish will be interviewing Rob about the situation and what can be expected. So on behalf of FPRI, thank you for joining us. Thank you for keeping an eye on our website at fpri.org. And I will turn it over to Eilish.
Thank you for the introduction, Maya. And thank you to FPRI for hosting us today. I think I'd like to dive right in because every single day we're seeing, reports about how this Russian troop buildup is progressing, the number of soldiers on the border, near the border, within a certain number of kilometers of the border. So I would like to ask you, Rob, to start out by kind of painting a picture for us of what we're seeing on the ground near Ukraine's borders right now.
Sure. So I guess the starting point is what's happening right now near Ukraine is a continuation of something that started back in March in the spring. So Russia conducted a pretty large buildup back then. A lot of the equipment, maybe the most, remained behind and remained near Ukraine's borders. They announced a kind of withdrawal, but it wasn't a complete withdrawal. And what was really concerning in the spring was Russia moved a lot of equipment from the central military district out in Siberia, far away from the border of Ukraine. They moved that to a training area in Voronezh, right near the border. And most of that, I think all of that equipment remained behind after that buildup. And the big issue right now is that all that equipment remained there over the summer, and it's still there. And what we're seeing now in the last month or so, you're seeing an additional buildup starting again. And the focus is a lot of equipment, especially from the central military district, being moved again. And so we had a lot of equipment from the 41st Combined Arms Army that was moved in the spring. We're now seeing almost the kind of the remainder of what wasn't moved. A lot of that is being moved now, like the 55th Mounted Motorized Rifle Brigade. That's being moved to the area of Yelnya near Belarus. And what's concerning is that, so right now, I think the last estimate I saw is that Russia's around 50 battalion tactical groups near the border of Ukraine. Battalion tactical group is typically about 700 to 900 personnel. It's essentially a battalion, whether a motorized rifle or tank battalion, and then you place a lot of assets and supporting assets on it, like artillery, air defense, electronic warfare, so on. A lot of those assets might be kind of regimental or division assets that get pushed down, and so the battalion is a real combined arms kind of function. And that's a structure that Russia used in the fighting in Donbass earlier in 2014, 2015. Mm-hmm. What's concerning right now is that we've seen a lot of movement equipment that's far away from Ukraine. Obviously, the western and southern military districts already border Ukraine. A lot of that equipment obviously is permanently based there. What happened in the spring was that in addition to the central military district equipment, they moved a lot of the other equipment from the Western and Southern military districts. So VDV units from outside Moscow was moved to the border. Things by Chechnya near Georgia, that was moved near the border. That stuff was all moved back. The issue now is that we see an enhanced presence. I think they said about 50 BTGs, but it's a lot of it is equipment from far away. And so what it means is all this kind of heavy equipment from far away that takes time to move and is quite public moving. That's been moved now. It's being pre-positioned. A lot of the other equipment is stuff that's not as far away. So if you need to do a build up and actually conduct an invasion, that other equipment you can move much faster and with much less notice. And so that's the kind of the concerning aspect to it right now.
And so to kind of just put this in the political context, I think, at least for me, one thing that seems to set apart, this buildup we saw in the spring and what's been happening since, early November is kind of the pitch of Western concern. Like from following the news in Ukraine and from a Ukrainian perspective, things seem to have flipped. In the spring, Ukraine seemed genuinely very, very worried about what was happening, and their officials were trying to raise the alarm with Western allies. This time around, it feels as though it's happening the other way, and you have U.S. intelligence. You have reports of U.S. intelligence trying to raise the alarm for European allies, and then also the messaging coming from Ukraine has been a lot calmer, for lack of a better word. So is there anything you're seeing that we're seeing on the ground that might explain this switch in rhetoric?
So I think from what I've seen from Ukrainian officials, you've seen a mix. Some have been quite concerning, asking for a lot of equipment. Some have been maybe not as concerning. I'm not sure what's going on there, but the one of the things that was reported, at least over the summer or over the weekend, is that the U.S. intelligence had information that was not public to some of the European countries, and that they shared a lot of that information this weekend, and that European countries that were less concerned now are more concerned. And so, we can kind of speculate about what that is. I think the big issue is that from open source information, the buildup is continuing, right? It's large. I think what Washington Post reported was that it looks as though they're building up to 100 BTGs as the size. So they're about 50 or so right now. 100 BTGs, put in perspective, that's about 2/3 of Russia's ground combat power. All right, so BTG, I already gave you the number for it, but those are permanent readiness units with contract soldiers, not conscripts. And so those are the units that really.
Sorry to interrupt, but is this kind of that number that we're seeing in the news that's like 175,000 troops?
Yes. So
just to put it in terms of numbers of people.
So we're seeing. So some of the information is a little hard to parse because obviously I'm not looking at the intelligence. So the 100 BTG figure, if you extrapolate that into personnel, it'd probably be around 75,000 people. Okay. The additional 175,000 figure they're mentioning, it includes 100,000 reservists, it appears. It's a little bit fuzzier about that because the reservists, Russia's developed a new program which involves contract servicemen who are sort of as reservists. It's a new thing. It was already announced this summer. It appears that's what they're talking about. It's not completely. I'm not completely sure, to be honest. And so that part is a little hazy. But if you build up to 100 BTGs, either way, that's still a significant amount of combat power. And again, it represents about 2/3 of the Russian military's ground combat power.
So again, to kind of put this in more political context, I think what we're seeing from a lot of analysts is that, we have this military option that's being built up. It's on a very large scale. And it looks as though there could be an offensive kind of on multiple fronts in terms of Ukraine's perimeter. At the same time, a lot of people are emphasizing that it doesn't look as though a political decision has been made yet to actually carry out this kind of escalation. So is there, what do you think would be kind of the rationale for taking that political decision?
Sure. So let me step back for a second and talk about kind of spring buildup and kind of how we got here, if that makes sense. So what the reason why it's concerning now, there's often a kind of scare every year about Russia reinvaded Donbass and all those. And it's usually not based on any kind of real signal. Right? There's nothing real, but it's kind of just hysteria. This time it's not. Right? This time there are real reasons to be concerned. In the spring, Russian officials gave a couple of kind of demands or concerns what they were upset about. Some of those were about the Minsk agreements, about Ukraine not fulfilling the Minsk agreements. Some of it was about Ukraine, moving forces near the Donbass, trying to retake the Donbass, and they argued that was rationale for the buildup. And some of it was about NATO. So especially Shoigu, he mentioned that NATO, there's a large defender exercise that happened in the spring. NATO flights, other infrastructure near Russia's borders, and so it was a number of things, but it was basically about NATO and about Ukraine. And then obviously Putin and Biden had the summit in June. A lot of people, I think, thought that was the goal of the buildup, but it wasn't. And we know it wasn't because Russia left those forces there over the summer and didn't pull them home. And if the objective had been the summit, they would have pulled that back. So I don't know what Putin and Biden said, but I have a feeling Putin, when he was talking to Biden, was mentioning concerns about NATO cooperation with Ukraine and this kind of buildup in the area, and that there was basically that Russia had certain red lines. And Putin, the next day after that buildup ended, when he addressed the Federal Assembly, he mentioned red lines. He mentioned that if anyone goes past the red lines, which he left it vague, he didn't specify what they were, that Russia will respond harshly in an asymmetric manner. And so, and Medvedev also released an article around the same time that was kind of very similar about the rationale. When you look at what happened since that summit, right, with respect to Ukraine and NATO, it's pretty obvious why Russia is upset. And so, on one hand, with NATO specific things, NATO has continued arms sales to Ukraine. U.S. has continued delivering javelins. We delivered 2 Coast Guard cutters recently. The UK signed a big 1.7 billion pounds loan to deliver ships as well. Turkey continued to deliver these TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles. And they've increased that cooperation. They're going to now conduct localized production. You also had the HMS Defender incident in June, and you had that one of the TB2s used by Ukraine conducted an airstrike in the Donbass on a separatist target. And so all those things, right, Putin obviously wasn't too clear about what his red lines were. Pretty clear that these things were all things that Russia considered to be provocative and against their interests, and they're upset about those things. And so I don't think it's a surprise that after that TB2 strike, that's when we started seeing a lot of the buildup, the renewed buildup, and kind of the kind of increasing of tensions. So it's a proximate cause, not the underlying cause. Obviously, this goes back to the spring. And so I think when we look about what Russia's looking for right now, Russian officials have been pretty clear. So Sergei Lavrov the other day mentioned basically the Minsk agreement has to be fulfilled, or else we will use force. So it was kind of it sounded like a compelling demand. Putin has been very clear about the risk of kind of creeping NATO defense cooperation with Ukraine. And he mentioned in an address to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that if NATO ever deployed cruise missiles or hypersonic missiles in Ukraine, the distance to Moscow is very short, and so it would change the kind of security situation. And so all those kind of things are what Russia's responding to. And I think basically when Russia looks back at the spring buildup and a summit, I don't think that accomplished their objectives. I think they look at it as a failure because of what happened over the summer and all the kind of, I think that was designed to deter this kind of future defense cooperation. It didn't do that. And so now we're in a situation where basically Russia is upping the ante again and trying to once again say, here are the clear red lines. This is what you're violating, and we're going to respond before it goes too far. And in terms of arms deliveries, javelins and TB2s, they're not really that strategically significant, right? They don't really threaten Russian forces that much. I think what their concern is this kind of creeping gradual increase in defense supplies. And so if you remember going back to 2014, the Obama administration initially didn't want to give any kind of lethal aid to Ukraine. Then the Trump administration decided to send javelins, but with caveats that wouldn't be allowed to use to be at the front. Then the caveats got removed, and then Turkey started deploying TB2s, which is kind of more offensive aid, and that started being used in the Donbass. And so basically, I think from Russia's perspective, it's been this gradual increase of no lethal aid to lethal defensive aid with caveats to no caveats to offensive aid being used. And so I think what they want to do is they want to now preempt anything going forward, and they see they're in a position of strength to do it right now. And they really, I think, want to make clear that they see the red lines are being crossed, and they don't think that NATO or Ukraine is abiding by it, as they're trying to use this kind of threat of force to gain concessions and to change that.
Okay, I mean, from just speaking of what we're hearing Ukraine saying, like they're being very explicit about the fact that they're not planning on to take the Donbass by force, that they're not looking to escalate the situation militarily, and they're you have Zelenskiy in parliament on December 1st saying that he would be open to direct talks with Russia. At the same time, it's been pretty clear from Moscow that they don't really want to come to the table with Ukraine. Like a lot of the rhetoric you're talking about is about Ukraine, but it's not necessarily directed at Kiev, right? It's still directed at NATO, it's directed at Washington. At the same time, I mean, like Ukraine would be the one on the our end would be the ones on the front line facing this very direct military threat. And their capabilities have changed since 2014, obviously. The armed forces have been built up significantly. At the same time, presumably, Russia's capabilities have changed as well. So in terms of making this threat of force, is it possible that Russia is underestimating just how painful this kind of incursion could be?
No, I don't think so. So
Okay.
I think, you asked me before about whether or not Putin has decided kind of what to do. I'm not sure he has. I think, as I said before, because they already had the spring build up and Russia's kind of demands then or concerns were not kind of, we didn't accept them. Now I think the situation is more difficult because now the buildup was more secretive. There's more kind of meat to this buildup, and it's more concerning this time. I think the real issue is that I think this is basically a last warning where Russia's showing if you keep pushing the red lines, we will invade or we will use military force, and you won't have notice. Because right now there's obviously some we're seeing things being moved. Obviously there's high intentions, so we know what's going to be going on. They wouldn't be surprised if they invaded tomorrow or what have you. But if they kept forces there for 5, 6, 7 months, you can only stay on your high alert so long. So I think, sorry, I blanked on what you were asking. Sorry, what can you ask that again?
Oh, no, I mean, my question ended with, is Russia underestimating, how painful this could be in terms of an incursion into Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different options. And so first off, I think when we talk about what Russia's goals would be, I think it's about compellence. And so the objective, so some people have been talking about, Russia wants to take more territory, or, they talk about the Crimean Canal, or all these kind of things. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. What Russia wants to do is, they have the two goals. One is related to Ukraine. One is about NATO support. The one about Ukraine, the question is how ambitious are those goals, and what would they be willing to accept below that, right? And so the concern is, if they really try and force the Minsk agreement through, is their main goal to enforce or force some kind of constitutional change in Ukraine that would forever change its political orientation? That would be a more ambitious goal. If it's smaller and it's related to NATO, you might be able to use force in a different way that kind of changes that dynamic. I think the threat is, right, there are different courses of action they could use. One is you could on a more less aggressive measure, they could start shooting down any kind of Ukrainian UAVs that are flown. They could use cyber. They could use other kind of methods that wouldn't kill Ukrainian soldiers. The next step that I see, which is concerning, is that Russia could use its really capable ground-based fires capabilities, which is a significant advantage over Ukraine's, and use that to target Ukrainian artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, command and control systems. And Russia has a really sophisticated fires capability between multiple launch rocket systems, cruise missiles, ground-based short-range ballistic missiles. It's a lot of really scary stuff. The other option beyond that is that there'd be some kind of, and you could do that without necessarily a ground invasion, right? And you can still inflict a lot of pain without an invasion. And ultimately the goal is, if it's through compellence, is to change the incentive structure for Kyiv, and to change it in a way that basically makes it, making concessions is the easier option, the preferable option, than to kind of hold out, right? And so depending on how ambitious your goal is, you might have to inflict more or less pain. And so maybe targeting Ukraine for killing a lot of Ukrainian servicemen, destroying Ukrainian units, that might be enough for certain objectives. Other ones, if it's really ambitious, it might require a real invasion. I think the objective would be not necessarily to take terrain, although that would be part of it. It would be to threaten, Kyiv, to threaten other kind of really key areas, something where basically Zelensky would look at the situation and say, I have to give in, because if I don't, the threat is so bad that it basically conceding is the better option. And so I think from Russia's perspective, they obviously have a lot of recent combat experience. They have a very capable military. They're amassing really elite, capable units. They have a lot of all their regimental commanders have combat experience. They've all deployed, and they have really sophisticated fire capabilities. So artillery, MLRS, all those kind of things. And so the concern is if they conduct an invasion and they really choose to use this, I think we kind of underestimate how violent and fast conventional warfare is. But it's really, really violent, and we haven't seen a country like the U.S. or another peer adversary really use that conventional power in a kind of aggressive way. They always kind of try to limit it. If they don't do that, they try and really maximize it. It's something like you talk about tens of thousands of casualties a day. So I think if Russia did this, the idea would be they think this is the right time to preempt this, and they think this is the right time to force this kind of terms on Ukraine. And if they did an invasion, it wouldn't be something limited. I think it would be driving to the capital, trying to really force really difficult changes on Ukraine, because anything short of that, right, they might not make those kind of concessions. That would obviously, a lot of those scenarios would involve Russians getting killed. How many, I don't know. But I think what Russia's leadership is looking at right now is they want to solve this issue now. They don't want to wait. And I think the big problem with Ukraine is, you mentioned about Ukraine's military, they are getting more capable, right? They're getting more capable. They're developing longer range weapons. And from Russia's perspective, on a national security level, they see, Ukraine is a kind of hostile country. After the last election, you had two candidates. Both of them were very hostile to Russia, right? I think Russia looks at this and they look at the long-term orientation of Ukraine and say, you know what, it's never going to be back to what it was before. It will always kind of be more hostile to us. The idea of retaking the Donbass is at least explicitly their goal, and they keep investing in defense capabilities, military capabilities. I think they want to preempt it before Ukraine becomes too powerful and becomes a bigger issue. They want to preempt it now when they're in a relative position of power. And so I think that's what's going in their kind of cost benefit analysis. But again, it's still hard to tell exactly what they'll do. But I don't think they're bluffing. I think there's a real chance in the spring and the summer that Russia could invade and could conduct a really large-scale invasion.
Okay. Just before we continue, I'll just remind our audience, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function to submit those, and I'll try to kind of combine them and put them forward during a Q&A session in sort of the latter half of our hour here. I think we've just spent a lot of time talking about the worst case scenario. So I'd like to kind of turn our attention to, the potential for de-escalation. Biden and Putin are having a virtual summit tomorrow. Is there, room to de-escalate the crisis diplomatically, do you think? Or, like I said, we've talked about the worst case scenario. You seem to be arguing that the situation seems pretty far gone. So how much, room to maneuver is there for Washington, for NATO, but also for Kiev? Because like I said before, it doesn't appear as though Russia is trying to bring Ukraine to the table under any types of conditions that they would agree to. If they're trying to force through the Minsk agreements, as they are, like, no Ukrainian leader is going to go for that under, the current circumstances, because domestically speaking, it would be political suicide, frankly. Like, there's not any kind of grassroots support for that. And Ukrainians have made it very clear that they are prepared to fight.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm a little pessimistic. I think, so yeah, when we look at what kind of tools the U.S. has, right, there's we're trying to change Russia's cost benefit analysis here. Part of that is by raising costs if Russia invades, and part of that is by some kind of inducements to make not invading a kind of more attractive option. As you were saying, because the two demands are about kind of Ukrainian domestic issues or about NATO cooperation in Ukraine, I think the NATO side is an easier one, right? And a lot of the ways, there are a lot of limitations that we have in our relationship, but they're not necessarily spelled out, right? So it's pretty clear. Obviously, U.S. officials keep saying Ukraine has a pathway to NATO membership. It seems pretty clear that's not really in the cards, for the foreseeable future. That might be something where the U.S. could concede and say, you know what, this won't happen. Maybe that's part of a concession they can make. Another one is specifying what kind of weaponry we would not, ever deliver to Ukraine or base in Ukraine, right? So, that could be ballistic missile systems, cruise missiles, munitions that have a range of more than 10 kilometers, things along those lines where it wouldn't upset the balance of power. And, maybe making some kind of public declaration, that would be enough. Not clear to me if that's true. Part of the issue here is also that, part of this is a U.S.-Russia relationship, part is a NATO-Russia issue, and part is a Turkey-Russia issue. And the Turkey-Russia issue is a whole other kind of situation going on because they've had a really significant competition in Libya, in Idlib, and in Karabakh, and this is a factor in that too. And I think deliveries of the TB2 UAVs from Turkey to Ukraine, that's something I don't think the U.S. would have ever provided. I think it's more provocative. I think probably we would consider it too provocative. So I think part of the issue is if we were to say, okay, we won't ever deliver this kind of equipment to Ukraine, we would have to get maybe Turkey to buy into that too. Would they be willing to? I'm not so sure. So I think part of it is we could look at certain things where we could say we already have these policies in place. Informally, we could formalize them and make that kind of public statement. I don't know if that'd be enough. As you're saying, in terms of enforcing Minsk agreements or some of the kind of constitutional change on Ukraine, that's much more of a problematic topic. Obviously, it's not U.S.'s position to do that. Anything that's really impinging on Ukraine's sovereignty becomes much more, unpalatable and is a bigger issue. So, so the big question becomes, how ambitious are Russia's goals, and at what level would they be willing to kind of, okay, you making some concessions, we make some, and we find some kind of modus vivendi. That's the big question to me, is I don't know what that is. And if they are really dead set on forcing through the Minsk agreement or some other kind of constitutional change on Ukraine, I'm not sure there is anything the U.S. can do in terms of inducements to satisfy that. And I think Russia might say they'll have to use force as a means of achieving that. We talk about deterrence. So a lot of people have mentioned, deploying NATO forces to Poland or, kind of other steps. I personally think, Russia looked at what we did in 2014, which was not to send troops, not to send lethal aid, right? Not too much. It was sanctions, and that was about it. So I think from Moscow's perspective, if they decide to invade again, unless the U.S. or NATO member deploys troops to Ukraine, right, especially in like eastern Ukraine, unless that happens, I don't think Russia thinks any deployment of troops to Europe would have any kind of credibility, because ultimately it doesn't seem any NATO members are really willing to put their service members at risk to defend Ukraine. And so I think deploying more troops could actually make the situation worse, because it could preempt Russia to invade, thinking, okay, we need to preempt it now before these kind of steps are made. I think a better option, if we look at deterrence, is right now they've been talking a lot about sanctions. Sanctions are fine. I'm not the expert in that, so I don't know how much kind of more we can go and actually have effects. I think the really big thing is that when we look at Russia's national security perspective, the reason for intervening in Ukraine would be mostly about national security reasons, right? It'd be gain something because they see Ukraine's orientation, they see what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years. I think that's a concern. So ideally, the deterrent steps would be some way make Russia's security situation worse if they went through with that. And so the number of things that NATO has not done, because there's certain steps that would be provocative, considered escalatory or destabilizing from Moscow's perspective. One of those is, we limit what we deploy to the Baltics, we limit what we deploy to Poland. Right now we have kind of quite small forces there. We could deploy ballistic missile defenses to the Baltic countries. We could deploy cruise missiles or other missiles that have the range to strike Moscow or St. Petersburg into Estonia. Obviously, that's something they have agreement with. But those are kind of steps where then when Russia looks at their security position, then it becomes a question of, okay, whatever benefits we get from intervening in Ukraine, are those offset by costs associated with things that NATO might do, and that might change the cost benefit analysis for Russia. I'm not sure, but I think those are the things to look at: is NATO increasing its security posture, things that would put Russia in a more difficult position, and I think one of them also is, I think someone wrote an op-ed about Sweden and Finland possibly going for NATO membership if this happens. That's another kind of thing that becomes changes Russia's security position right away. And so I think that's part of it, is looking at things where, okay, what issue, and when I was talking about ballistic missile defenses, Russia mentions that all the time about destabilizing, being provocative. Well, if Russia invades Ukraine, it's destabilizing as well, right? It's an escalatory thing. And so, NATO, it would probably be a good thing to make public commitments, ideally, that we would do these certain things, which we know you will not like, if you do this thing, which we will not like. And so I think that I haven't heard too much in the way of that yet, but I think those are kind of steps about deterrence. And then, and on the other hand, as I was saying, I think it's okay to have discussions, dialogue about the security architecture of Europe. And I don't have an issue with that. I don't have an issue with necessarily formalizing some limitations on things we would, what kind of weapons we'd move near Russia's borders. Obviously, they have a right to be concerned about those things. So I think there should be an element of carrots and sticks. I haven't heard in terms of sticks as much of the kind of security side. And I've heard more about sanctions, and I think there's other things we can do
for sure
that might kind of change their cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what we're not hearing a lot of kind of concrete commitments from Washington, from Brussels, from anyone, frankly. I mean, the most recent news we saw coming from the White House is that we have this kind of comprehensive deterrence package being put together. And by comprehensive deterrence package, they seem to mean economic sanctions, right? Like the biggest kind of nuclear option they've talked about is disconnecting Russia from the SWIFT system of international payments. So that would, effectively block Russian businesses from their access to the global financial system. And like I said, that's the nuclear option. And that seems to be something they're talking about in terms of, if Russia were to invade Ukraine, this is what we would do afterwards. Like, there's not a whole lot of talk about economic sanctions as an attempt to preempt any of this. In terms of security, one thing we have seen, very, very recently from the Ukrainian side over the weekend in an interview with the Globe and Mail, Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, he was saying, he was encouraging NATO member states to kind of act outside of NATO. Like, he was saying, like, Canada, Britain, the US should send troops to Ukraine, should bulk up their training missions, and that would send a message to Russia in terms of, international support for Ukraine. Do you think there's any potential there, given that, the other option, economic sanctions, seems to be an after option?
Yeah, so I don't really. So I think the issue is, of the weaponry we provided, some of the stuff is useful, but it doesn't significantly alter the balance of power. It doesn't really significantly alter the military situation. Russia can handle TB2s, right? Javelins are a threat, but Russia has really capable weapons and those systems. Like, if they invade and they intend to do things, they will be able to do that. They have the combat power to do that. So in terms of a lot of those steps, I think there was just an article about Ukraine asking for some new weaponry. The issue is, it's kind of like deploying troops to Poland or somewhere else. If we're not going to send troops to fight and defend Ukraine, a lot of those steps, right, all it does is pushes kind of Russia's red line a little bit. And it says, okay, we might need to act now to preempt further, training, defense cooperation between NATO and Ukraine. And so I don't think those steps are necessarily useful unless we're going to say, we are going to put troops to defend Ukraine, and we're actually going to send them there. Short of that, I think a lot of those steps wouldn't be particularly useful. I think it's more about what are the things that Russia finds in a security perspective destabilizing, not necessarily associated with Ukraine but elsewhere, and how can we should we make public commitments to pursue those options which we wouldn't otherwise if Russia does these kind of actions. And that's I think that's a more useful kind of way to look at it. So I don't think it's as much about Ukraine. I think it's about we will take actions with other countries elsewhere in NATO, and that will make Russia's position worse if you do this in Ukraine. Whereas I think a lot of support for Ukraine directly might not be as helpful. I think indirect support is probably better in the situation.
So in terms of Biden and Putin meeting tomorrow, you said earlier that you don't think the summit in June really achieved anything in terms of reorienting Russia's calculus when it comes to the spring buildup. Do you think we could see something change after tomorrow?
It's hard to know. So far,
it's speculation, of course.
Yeah. So all the Biden administration people have basically said, I think Biden himself said, I don't respect Russia's red lines. They push back against kind of any ultimatums. I fully expect Putin will give ultimatums tomorrow, and he'll say, these are lines. We don't like these things you've done. I tried to warn you in June, and now we're here. And if you go past these lines again, the threat of force is credible. And obviously, all the kind of reporting from the intelligence side, indicates that the intelligence community thinks that is credible as well. Again, I think the issue is if we continue what we're doing, I think there's a good chance that Russia will invade Ukraine. And unless we make some concessions or we create some kind of dialogue of looking at the security architecture of Europe and really addressing it in a really profound way, where we say, okay, we're going to make a real interest in this, and we're actually going to look at tangible things we can achieve. Unless that happens, I'm so pessimistic. I'm sure they'll probably have a positive readout tomorrow, but ultimately the situation won't change. And the issue is, if these red lines keep getting pushed, or at least from Russia's perspective, the next time there won't be a warning. I think it'll just be an invasion. And they have the military capabilities there, where if they need to very quickly move those units in and actually invade, right, they can do it on short notice. And that's what's really concerning about it's the public source kind of information about what's built up near Ukraine's borders.
Okay, well then, hypothetically speaking, like let's say that happens and the West takes Russia's red lines as they're stated and complies to kind of bring down the temperature. What's to keep Russia from moving its red lines? Because we've already sort of seen the move, right? Like in 2014, all of this kicked off because of Ukraine having the Maidan revolution and the population, overthrowing Yanukovych and clearly showing that popular support is behind this kind of EU path and direction. Now the issue seems to be NATO. 7 years later, the issue seems to be NATO, or the Kremlin rhetoric is focusing on NATO. Like, what's to keep the red lines from just constantly shifting?
Yeah, so I think Russia's objective right now is that Ukraine will not become a bigger threat than it is right now. And so the issue, of course, is how can you prevent that, right? If politically, Ukrainian officials are keep investing in defense capabilities. They make it very clear that they want to retake Donbass. They're not willing to make concessions that Russia wants, and these appear to be popular policies in Ukraine. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. Again, I think part of the reminder here is that we're in a position because of actions Russia took, right? And so if they hadn't intervened in 2014, very well the next guy who got elected may have still been vaguely pro close to Russia. Support for NATO membership wasn't very sizable at the time. Russia, by removing Crimea and the Donbass, they forever changed Ukraine's electoral orientation, and you're now, that's why you're seeing much more hawkish individuals who are running and succeeding in Ukrainian politics. And so this is in some ways it's Russia responding to actions it took 7 years ago that still haven't paid fruit, and they haven't really given them the long-term objectives they want. And so it's another attempt at a short-term kind of maneuver. It's hard to say. It's hard to say if they'll change the red lines. I think we looked over the last 7 years, right? Early on, we weren't providing lethal aid to Ukraine. we are now. So they might say, hey, you have made changes from what you were doing before. And ultimately, part of the issue too is that they're developing their own long-range weapon systems. And so even if we don't provide those, how will Russia respond if they're developing systems that can target Russian cities or Russian units that are farther away from the border? I don't know. There isn't a great kind of, I don't know if there's a great solution to this. So I think the question though is, Russia has red lines regarding Ukraine. I'm not sure those apply as much elsewhere, at least in this respect, because Ukraine is such a kind of important and specific case for Russia. So, if we did make certain concessions here, I don't think that would threaten, Article 5 and for other NATO members. I don't know if it would threaten other countries. That could still be Ukraine specific, but it's kind of just speculation. It's hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to kind of underscore what you said, that Russia is kind of responding to a problem of its own creation. Like, nearly 8 years of aggression has really alienated Ukraine at a grassroots level, at the level of the political elite. I mean, at the same time, I wouldn't describe Zelenskyy's administration as, hawkish, especially compared to Poroshenko. I mean, he's, running on an army language faith ticket didn't get Poroshenko reelected. Right. Zelensky, he promised the population peace. And he still, seems to be pushing for kind of these diplomatic solutions. But like we said earlier, nobody wants to come to the table and implement the Minsk agreements as they are. The Normandy format talks have stalled. Even, Angela Merkel wasn't able to secure another Normandy meeting before leaving office. I think, at the same time, what kind of strikes me as interesting, and I think we probably disagree here, because you were saying, because of what you said about the earlier Biden-Putin summit in June, I think, some people made the argument that Putin was sort of seizing on this opportunity to send a message to a new administration. And I think that's something important to keep in mind. Like, the countries that are at the negotiating table in terms of Ukraine, US is not one of them, but France, Germany, and Ukraine, they're all democratic governments. You all see changes, and you see the potential for the country's line on Russia to change, right? And I think in Europe right now, we are also seeing a situation where the status quo could be upended in a way that Russia won't necessarily like, right? Like, you have a new government coming in Germany. France is having elections next year. So I feel like we don't agree here, but in my mind, I feel like in a way it could be, possible that part of this is signaling to new people in power that Russia doesn't want to see the status quo upended.
So I don't disagree with you there. I think I absolutely think when the buildup started was in March, right? The decision was probably made in February, so this is right after Biden came in, and so I absolutely think that this is somewhat tied to Biden coming in and trying to in the beginning, in the first couple months, Biden, I think, called Putin a killer. So they made some guys comment about Russia pay a price to do certain things. Russian officials did not like that. So there is certainly, the buildup is certainly tied to a new administration and trying to develop some kind of rules of the road for the Biden administration, in addition to kind of Ukraine specific things. But yeah, I'm sorry. What was the other part of your statement? Sorry, at the end.
Oh no, I was just saying, like, the situation we saw with the new Biden administration coming in and sending, a different set of signals to Moscow in terms of what relations would be, right. Compared to what the Trump administration had done. Now we're seeing similar changes in Europe, especially in Germany, where you have, this new coalition government coming in. Merkel's no longer in office. And yeah, I mean, it's very possible that Germany could change its line on Russia as well, right?
So what's interesting is that, when you look at the Trump administration, the Biden administration, yes, obviously Donald Trump was rhetorically much more positive about Russia, and obviously, the Helsinki meeting was, unique. But even during that time, the Trump administration was the one decided to send javelins to Ukraine, initially with caveats, and then after that, without caveats, they removed them. Russian officials have also been quite angry about and Putin mentioned this, about U.S. strategic bomber flights near Crimea. That happened in 2020. So that was in August 2020. There's a series of flights with Ukrainian Air Force fighters, and it was literally 20 kilometers from the border of Crimea. So there were a lot of things during the Trump administration that the U.S. military was doing that were quite hawkish, that arguably were more hawkish than what's going on now. And so I think obviously Putin appreciated the kind of rhetorical difference between Trump and Biden. But I think a lot of the steps that he was taking in the Black Sea and with Ukraine, that occurred under Trump as well. And so Biden has continued some of those. They haven't done, I don't think they've done any strategic bomber flights recently, but I think the Trump administration was still a bit confusing for Russia, where, on one hand, they're happy with the rhetoric, they're happy with a lot of things Donald Trump was doing. On the other hand, the U.S. and the DoD and the administration was doing a lot of hawkish things towards Russia. Whether or not Trump was aware of that, I don't know. But so I think from Russia's perspective, they were a bit confused by that. And I think in some ways, the Biden administration, it's a return to normalcy, even if it's a little more negative. I think they appreciate the normalcy to an extent. And I think they're more. I think they think they're more willing. Biden administration more willing to kind of pull back some of those things and to maybe make concessions, because obviously the Biden administration is more focused on China and wanted to treat Russia as kind of not a concern to this time.
I'm skimming through the Q&A section here, just so everybody knows I am looking at your questions and trying to kind of bundle the ones that are similar together. We do have a question in here about Belarus and the role Belarus plays in all this. Like, I don't want to try to connect too many dots, but in recent days we have seen some inflammatory statements from Lukashenko. He's talked about visiting Crimea, recognizing it as Russian territory. He's talked about standing with Russia in the event of Ukrainian aggression. If you've turned off the video, I did air quotes. And so where do you see Belarus in all of this?
So I don't think that this was related to the two events were related. So I think more likely it was Lukashenko's initiative with the migrant crisis and that kind of new tension that happened there. I think the timing, obviously, once that became a NATO, Belarusian, point of contention, obviously that became a part of the issue with Ukraine as well, because that was also a point of tension as well. And obviously, Russian foreign policy has a history of issues with principal agent issues, where Assad, Lukashenko, other individuals who are Russian allies often act on their own and do things that are not in Russia's interests. Lukashenko does that a lot, and so especially the last year. So and what we've typically seen with both Assad and Lukashenko, even after they've taken action that Russia doesn't necessarily like, Russia always backs them, and they don't want to show there's daylight between them. And so I don't think the migrant crisis was something that Russia thought up. I don't think it was tied to Ukraine. Obviously, once tensions built and once Poland moved greater forces to the Belarusian border, that kind of became part of the issue as well. But I don't think they were playing at the same time. I think the tension around Ukraine is kind of one thing. I think that the issue with Belarus is a bit separate, although obviously they're both standpoints, or they're both flashpoints between Russia and NATO. So in that regard, they become somewhat conflated.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there that the migrant crisis is definitely a problem of Lukashenko's own making, and not necessarily related. But of course, these things get pulled in. I'm looking at the questions here. One question that's come up a couple of times here is in terms of sort of the timing. And I don't think we really addressed this at the beginning. Kind of reports we're seeing in the media about what US and European intelligence are saying, they're now placing the timing for any kind of Russian incursion in late January, early February. So they're looking at it as a sort of winter invasion. Is that something that makes sense based on what we're seeing on the ground, or like in terms of like having a winter campaign versus something that could even get pushed over into the spring?
So obviously, qualifier, I don't know what the intelligence says, and obviously there's stuff behind it that I can't see, so it's hard to take too much. I think from my reading of what the reports were saying was that Russia had the ability to conduct an operation starting in January, February. Not necessarily that is the time for it. I think what's more likely is that Russia will deploy enhanced force. And it already has an enhanced force, but will continue to deploy enhanced force. Obviously, we'll see if something happens tomorrow. And then, right, because this buildup's happening, there are a lot of tensions, a lot of attention to it right now. If Russia ever decided to invade or escalate, they would do it and they try to achieve surprise. They did that in Crimea, they did that in Syria. They're very effective at achieving surprise, and they're pretty good at obscuring what they're doing. So I think it's more likely we wouldn't see an invasion in January because it's kind of too soon to this buildup and they're still moving things. I think it's more likely they'd keep the forces there for months, and then maybe in the spring and the summer, if they're not seeing what they want, they can then respond at that time. And again, as a reminder, they might respond to another event, like if Ukraine uses another TB2 strike in the Donbass, they might decide, okay, that's now the cause. We are now going to respond to that as the region. So I think it's more that they'll have the capacity to do it. I don't think there's a time associated necessarily when Russia would invade yet. But I think it's more likely they would want to wait a little bit, because then there'd be more of a gap between the buildup and their invasion, and not likely they'd achieve more surprise. So yeah, I'm not as concerned about invasion right away, but I think it's more likely we're going to live in a situation where for 6-7 months, maybe longer next year, Russia will have an enhanced force and could invade on short notice at any time. And so that's kind of the situation I think we'll have.
Okay, I think that's a pretty good note to end on, actually. So thank you very much, Rob. Thank you to FPRI for hosting us. And if you would like to continue following our coverage of what's going on in the region, you can check back in at fpri.org under the Eurasia program. We'll have updates there. And of course, you can subscribe to the BNB Russia and BNB Ukraine newsletters for weekly updates. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and have a good day.